Hi, everybody. Welcome to join us today. I'm pleased to be joined by Ann-Louice Bruhn. And Ann-Louice is an expert in market access. It's just a very important area, and she's going to share all sorts of great insights with us. So welcome, Ann-Louice. We're really excited to talk to you today. Let's just start by kicking things off. Just maybe introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your background and your expertise in this area.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Dario, for having me. It's really exciting. I've been following your interview series and I learn something new every time. So I really like it. And so my name is Ann-Louice Bruhn, and I love creating sustainable market access solutions to not only bring new life science to the world, but also to ensure that patient outcomes is improved. I'm actually Swedish originally, and I started out my healthcare career as a nurse. I've worked in both clinical, medical, business operations, as well as brand and portfolio strategy. And I lived abroad almost all my life. And I worked in so many different health systems, both in Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, several other European systems I've been engaged in. And now I've been here in the US the last 10 years. And I have to say it is a complex system here, but there are actually more similarities than differences if you think about the big picture. And I'm really excited to share some of my perspectives today.
I mean, that's great having all that global perspective. And we certainly think of, this area probably being very different, but the similarities, that'll be interesting perspective as well. So for early stage medtech or healthcare AI founders who just might be getting overwhelmed, getting their technology functional, why is it so critical to be thinking about market access and reimbursement before they've even finalized the product or their go-to-market strategy?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And number one, I would say, is that developing that product and market fit takes time. That's number one. And number two, it is complex. There are many stakeholders, many different processes that you need to make sure you fit in. But I would say, and I know we're going to touch on that today, and I will make sure to give very tangible examples and thoughts. But it takes time to build that product and market fit. And if you start too late, you will actually, you don't have a runway once you launch the product. And you have to build it then, and then you have no revenue. So it's really about making sure you are ready when you are launching to have done all these critical steps and having everybody aligned so you can really launch the product flawlessly. And I'll go in more detail a little bit further on, because I know you give me some opportunity to share some examples.
Sure. So you mentioned that founders often don't even know maybe the right questions to ask about reimbursement until it's too late. Maybe what are, one or two of the most common blind spots or misconceptions that you see in this area?
I think one is, and I actually fell in the trap a moment ago myself, talking about the complexities and the many stakeholders. That is somewhat true, but in essence, it is quite simple, because you need to, as a founder, you are of course laser focused on building a company, making sure the product is viable, and you're really laser focused on execution. Market access is really about focusing forward in terms of who is going to use your product when it comes to the market. And more importantly, in my case, is who is going to pay for it and how is it going to be reimbursed? And that's really a fundamental question that you need to ask yourselves. And I have a couple of examples when it can go wrong, right? If you imagine a new product, a new medicine that requires molecular testing and a new testing before you can actually prescribe the product, that works in the clinical trial setting. But when it comes in the hospital setting, you need to make sure that the hospital code actually includes that molecular testing for that disease. And then it needs to be, of course, covered by either, private insurance or a government insurance. And that is something that the manufacturer or the developer of that product has to put in place. And if you don't have it, you are actually putting the provider or the hospital with all the risk of course, wanting to use it, but not being sure if they would actually be covered and reimbursed, which is not something that they can handle.
Yeah, imagine it's a non-starter, right? If you don't have it covered.
Yeah, and I would add also, this is the same for digital technology as well. So, I mean, we have tons of new health tech startups, and I work with several of them. And of course, if you think about you're going to provide maybe an Apple Watch or something for free and monitor tremor or any kind of symptoms that then can help them provide better care. Well, that's great. And of course, everybody wants to have an Apple Watch, but it takes time for the clinician or the nurse to actually inform the patient. That time needs to be billed. So one needs to make sure that you know which code to use, which code to add on your services to, and make sure that the provider knows so they don't feel that they are using their time ineffectively. And I have a feeling that they need more support than we originally think. It's not that complicated, right? But it is complicated in their day-to-day life.
Sure,
So you need to understand how to really build that product and market fit for them to make it easy for them.
Cool. We'll get into reimbursement codes here in a little bit. But so U.S. healthcare payment landscape really seems to be quite complex. So for a startup just beginning to think about this, what's the most fundamental first step or question that they need to be addressing regarding who might eventually pay for their innovation?
I love that. Who may eventually pay for the renovation? I think the first step to start with is really to, first of all, understand, of course, who is the end user and what surrounds that end user. What is the actual care flow looking for that end user, and really take the time to map out who are the stakeholders, what matters to them, what are their incentives, how are they paid, and make sure that you have that foundation really solidified. And then when you do so, it's to understand the key processes and the timelines thereof. Does budget need to be assigned before? And if so, what are the timelines for that? And what are the criteria? What are the actual documentation in time? And that's a very systematic approach. And then, of course, it's to set a strategy for that and align it also with the regulatory and other strategic component to make sure that you have everything ready in time.
So it seems like you've got a couple of different paths here then. Certainly, from a selling perspective, you have to understand the decision-making process within whatever, an IDN or a complex, a hospital network. But you also have to understand the user perspective as well, right? The workflow around how that technology is going to be used, and ultimately how they come together, how it benefits the patient, and who ultimately pays for it, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up because coming with something new is all about disruption. You're changing something that the whole structure is used to. So you need to make sure that you not only understand it, but you also provide the right solution, which is, of course, the right codes. You need to provide, making sure that when they submit the code that it's actually covered. Also negotiate with the insurance companies and making sure that you're on the formulary list if that's applicable for your product or service. And then you need to make sure that all the billing, the practicalities of how the money is going to flow in the system, that is also something that the manufacturer of any service or any product needs to think about. Yeah.
So let's drill into reimbursement codes. You've mentioned that a few times. So obviously they're really important, but without getting overly technical, how should early stage companies, factor coding considerations into their product development and market access strategy?
I think it's really important to look at it not as a technical necessity, only technical and billing necessity, but really a strategic investment. And if you think about it like that, it kind of makes sense to include mapping out how to optimize the value of your product as early as possible. And my recommendation is really to, when you map out your different access stakeholders, the users and those surrounding the users, really map out the care and the billing flow at the same time. It is an excellent opportunity to ask a lot of questions to the user. How does it work? And then you may find out that it actually doesn't work excellent today with their day-to-day life. And maybe there is a way you can add something to your services to make it a little bit easier. And then suddenly you have an opportunity to sell a little bit better, right? And the other thing is that, do you need a new code, or can you add yourself to another code? That's also something, and CMS, everything is publicly available. You can search yourself, or you can find somebody who can help you to do search optimizations for you to really build the most robust, how can I say, not just value proposition, but also value delivery for yourself when they use your product. And the last part is, of course, strategic planning. You have to kind of include those submission timelines and needs when you plan your whole launch plan for your product, and not think of it as a technicality that you just need to solve just before. It's really something that you should do in parallel to the rest of the work.
Well, maybe just explain to me how you work with your clients then. Say you've got an earlier stage client, maybe they've got a big idea. How do you typically work with them? What's the process? Maybe what are the different sort of steps and paths, I guess, that work streams that are necessary?
Absolutely. So of course it starts with establishing a deep understanding of the product or the service provided. And then what I do, I mean, there is a method to this madness, you could say. What I do is that I really work with them to derive the insights from their early interaction with the customers. And then we structure that in terms of the care flow, the patient flow, the funding flow, and ask critical questions at each of these steps, so that you don't miss out any key component that can break this chain that you're trying to build for your product. So that's kind of the first foundation. And then the other part is that you map the value of the product and the services you provide with the needs of those stakeholders you have identified. And you try to find where there are, of course, wins, but also where there are challenges. And that helps you build a very strong value proposition, which then can be adapted to these different stakeholders depending on the needs. And from that value proposition, that's where you create the fourth step is really to create those dossiers, those submissions that you need to do. And I mean, I can be a person who helps with that, but there are also other experts that just do dossiers, and that's kind of their prime, what they do. Gotcha. And then you can bring those in to help with that particular milestone. And then, of course, it's to build that stakeholder engagement throughout the journey to make sure that you are constantly monitoring if there's something new happening, new guidelines, new routines, to make sure that you are having that product and market fit that you're trying to build.
So are founders typically then, when they sort of develop their market access strategy, are they then, is the best practice to negotiate with Medicare first or with the private insurers? What's sort of the I don't know, the path of least resistance, I guess?
So that's a very good question. So it depends on the product. So who is going to use the product? Is the product particularly used for an older population? Well, then that is maybe retired. Obviously, then Medicare is where you kind of need to start and make sure your focus is. If it's more of a working population or a broader age, well, then you need both. You need, and in which order you start, well, government insurance has a bit of a perhaps steeper discount in many cases, but they are a steady income for you. Once you're on, it's easier to renew. Whereas with the insurance companies, you of course there's a different kind of dynamic. Other dynamic is also, do you have a medical product or is it a healthcare service? It also depends on the product. There are different pathways for different products. Let's say you have an oral medication that is used by the working population. Well, then, yes, for sure, you need to make sure you have the insurance private insurance being willing to cover. So you have to submit, you have to negotiate with them to get on their formularies. So when the doctor prescribed, there is a easy pathway. And on top of that, to make sure it's easy for the patient, you also build out additional patient services to make sure that you hold the patient hand throughout that process. So that's kind of one pathway. And then on the governmental side, well, there is, I would say, less hand-holding, but new digital technology today actually allows you to, if your patient wants to use your medical product in this case, and they are not eligible because they're government, you can still maintain a relationship with these patients to provide educational support and so on. You can't help with patient access and reimbursement support, but you can help them in other ways. And then, of course, there are those that are not insured, right? So you need to make sure that you build pathways for those as well. So that's kind of when you think about a medical product. When you think about the digital service, it's somewhat easier because as soon as you have the codes and you have those things set up, it kind of as soon as they start using and the processes start running, it's kind of more automated, so to speak, because it's embedded in the systems.
Gotcha. So you mentioned a couple of things, Ann-Louice. So one, certainly, you want to get your reimbursement code, but secondly is placement on the formulary. So
Yes.
talk to us a little bit about that, because again, like getting a reimbursement code is obviously a good thing, but it doesn't guarantee you that you're going to be, whatever, prescribed or selected ultimately, correct?
Absolutely. And so I like to look at formularies with a multi-stakeholder lens. On one hand, you have the clinician that you want to use your product. There needs to be built advocacy, first of all, awareness and advocacy for using the product. That's one element. But that is not the only, obviously, because you also have to make sure that you have cost effectiveness, you have other value drivers built into your value proposition. So once you write that dossier, can be an AMCP dossier, it can be another dossier, but once you write that dossier, you need to make sure that you are positioned in the optimal way for where you want your product to be. And then ultimately it is a price negotiation. You have set your price, your list price, and then it's sometimes also, if you work with the insurance payers, the private insurance, it can be a PBM negotiation around what is that discount that we would like to see to make sure that you are optimizing their revenue stream as well, not just the hospital or the users. They have their own, of course, revenue stream, considering all the different products that are used in that particular class of therapy. That's a whole different element. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. It gives more of it's somewhat very broad how I'm speaking about it, but it's also because each medicine, if it's an oral medicine that you take at home, has a certain pathway. If it is a medicine that you are given in the doctor's office, so it's a provider administered medicine, it has a different pathway. And if it's a technical product or a healthcare product, you have yet another different pathway. So it's hard to give just one answer, a broad answer, but these are the key components. So the patient characteristics, the actual care delivery characteristics, and then who is actually covering in the end of the day. Those three elements are really defining and building a frame around the different paths you have to choose to get ultimately access to the patients.
So when you start working with a client, I imagine there's a fairly significant educational requirement, right? I mean, how much sort of upskilling and, do you have to provide just so that they can understand the process? Because, I mean, it's far more probably, I mean, it's very involved. Obviously, you've got a lot of different, like you said, stakeholders and pathways. There's a lot of things that need to kind of get done and come together and converge in order to put yourself in position to be successful, it seems.
Yeah, so there is certainly an upskilling, you could say. I mean, there is not only a lot of public information, which is great, so you can make sure you're using the latest version. But I like to work with case studies. And there's usually always someone who've done something similar to yourself, and that's a really good starting point. And then you can see, okay, and I make it very visual. And then we work through that case, and then we identify what is similar and what is different, and of course, what is the goal here. And then we take that information and then we run through the process as mentioned to really check all these tick boxes in terms of have you truly mapped up your different stakeholders that you need to engage me with? Do we fully understand the care processes? And I have templates for that, which I've developed over the years. Things to think about when you map out the care flow, things to think about when you map out the codes, and so on. And you kind of go through that. But yeah, there is an intense period in the beginning to make sure that me as a consultant, but any consultant, fully understand what the developer or the founder wants to accomplish.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then there is going to come a time where you have to decide on strategic options. Maybe the ideal is to have a certain value proposition or a certain study done, but that costs a lot of money. Then there are trade-offs to be made, and that can impact the time of uptake, for example, or alternative routes for reimbursement as well. So there's a number of factors you can play with there.
So what about I think what else seems really interesting to me? On one hand, you may be in the process of getting regulatory approval, but on the other hand, you need to probably proceed in parallel with getting reimbursement and access. So, I mean, is it a cart before the horse? Do you have to sort of make a little bit of a bet that, okay, the assumption is we're going to get approval, and then when we do, or like would Medicare or an insurance company give a conditional reimbursement? How does that dynamic typically play out, Ann-Louice?
Yeah, I love that question. And I know you and I have previously chatted about vertical planning or vertical integration. It is absolutely critical. And those who have the best launches, they do that. So it's actually parallel processes. And this is what I mentioned before. As a founder, you're very focused on the day-to-day, building the company, etc. But here, you have to put yourself in the future. And think about, okay, what is my target indication? What am I trying to aim for? If it's a product, or who is my target customer? And then you have to ultimately work backwards and do that both for the regulatory component, making sure you have the right pathways and the right approach there, which is not my subject matter expertise per se, but it's something that is very connected to the different access pathway later on. So that's one part though then. And then in terms of the reimbursement, it's about making sure that when you develop the product, that you maximize the insights gathering so you can have the best possible value proposition to please not only your regulators, but also the payers down the line. You need both clinical outcomes and cost effectiveness outcomes. And a little bit in between, which is the real world. How is it actually going to be used, and how it's going to fit in my care flow, so to speak. And that's something that you ideally do while you are running the development of your product. Because if you find something, as I mentioned earlier, maybe you find a gap or you find an issue that you need to solve for, then you have the time during this process to course correct and make sure that once you are launching, you're ready to hit the ground running.
Right. Excellent.
Yeah. So
So, for startups with limited budgets, accessing expert market access advice, I mean, to me, it seems daunting. Uh, any practical advice there, Ann-Louice? I mean, do they need like a high-priced consultant? What is sort of your recommended approach just for getting grounded in this?
It of course depends on, of course, the budget, but I would say it is, if you think about market access,
Yeah.
there's a lot of common sense and practical thinking that goes behind it. I would say that making sure that you partner with someone that actually can help you build that roadmap that you need for your product is really critical early. And that roadmap has to have the consideration that we talked about earlier with the stakeholders, what matters to them, what are the different processes you need to consider, and so on. So if you think about building that roadmap, is a bit of an investment. That's true. But after that, well, in addition to that, I would say a good consultant should tell you where your key milestone and pivot points are throughout this journey. You don't need handholding all the way through, but you need that foundation, and you need to understand what your strategic options are, what your considerations needs to be, and that needs to be documented with milestones. And then you can bring in spot advice as you go. And I think there is a misconception that you can, if you can hire and you get one answer to the question. There's usually not one answer to the question. There are options. And at the end of the day, it's ultimately where do you want to see this product go, and not just use, but also, is this maybe a first indication? Are there more indications coming if it's a medical product? And if it's a healthcare software product, for example, once you put it out there, what are your visions on how you're going to further expand it? And I think that roadmap can really help with that, to really early on crystallize, well, if you go this direction, these doors open, but these other doors are going to be closed for you if you don't do this additional work in parallel. And I think that conversation is really important to have very early.
Gotcha. Wow. So
Yeah.
this has just been a fantastic, fantastically insightful conversation, Ann-Louice. Just one final question. Given everything that we've just discussed, what are maybe the top, one or two takeaways for founders that might be watching this?
I think number one is really to think about the end user and the end payer really early, from the beginning, and embed that through the journey, and making sure that it's not coming in the last minute. That's really important. And so that's my first thing I would say. And the other thing is build that roadmap of not just the clinical flow or the patient flow, but also the care flow, the payment, the reimbursement flow, and the payment flow, and make sure that is mapped out so you have a proper roadmap for yourself for the future. And then, yeah, you will have an excellent market fit, and the product uptake will follow, which is exactly what we want, right? When we put a new product in the market.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, this has just been a fabulous discussion. Ann-Louice, thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise and insights. I would highly encourage anybody who, kind of is in that sort of stage that needs help to reach out to Ann-Louice. She's just an expert, but also a wonderful person that's very easy to work with. So would highly encourage that. And Ann-Louice, just want to thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dario. It's been a true pleasure. And yeah, I look forward to any questions. It's a pleasure, as I said, to have the opportunity to influence healthcare and try to help as many patients as possible. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah.